Hi, welcome to our session on data loading, unloading, and automation with Automodeler, part of the Irwin EA NBP suite. Automodeler is a bidirectional link from the MS Office suite, specifically Word, Excel, Project, and CSV files. It's designed to not only load data, but to also create diagrams and visualizations of your data. Automodeler works directly with your meta model to ingest legacy data, and it can also be used to extract diagrams, whether printing them or creating a PowerPoint or sending them to files. Automodeler functions include the following. First of all, you have the ability to load and unload data from a model, and that's working with your data. And then you have the ability to work with diagrams. So whether you're working with diagrams or working with styles. Extracting diagram pictures, that's where we can extract diagrams to images or create a PowerPoint with all of the diagram images. And also we can run administrative reports. The most common scenario is to load data with Automodeler, and you are usually presented with information in an Excel spreadsheet. In this case, you can see we have a column of activity names and a column of their categories. The way that Automodeler ingests the information is to treat each column either as a property or as an association of the initial primary object, and each row is an instance of that object. So in this case, assemble ordered tray is an example of an operational activity. Generate reports is an example of a system function. If I were to load this information in, it would create all of these activity objects for me with their corresponding categories. When you launch the load function, there is a column mapper. The column mapper allows you to choose specifically the fields that are in your spreadsheet, so the columns in your spreadsheet, and map them to the actual meta model in your model. So if you have content that doesn't yet match your meta model, you should go back to Model Explorer, modify the meta model if you have the appropriate access rights, then come back to Automodeler, to your spreadsheet, and reload the data in. Otherwise, you can always skip a column if things don't match, and you don't need to modify the meta model at this given time. So it's a very simple and straightforward process. You can also unload data to Excel to get all the column headers that are in your particular model for a particular object type. In this example of that, we will take information from Excel, we will load this content in, and what it will do is it will actually ask us if we wish to draw a diagram. We will say yes, and the result will look something like that, depending on your templates and depending on whether or not these categories of organizations have different colors and shapes and so forth. I've launched an Excel spreadsheet, and I've typed in the same information that was in the example. Now, the easiest thing to do is to highlight this information. Automodeler can also spot where things are, but I like to control the situation a little bit, so I simply highlight the information and I leave it open, and then I'm going to launch Automodeler from the splash screen. So when I launch Automodeler, if I'm not already logged in, I'm going to have to log into my instance of Irwin EA and provide my credentials if necessary, unless you have single sign-on, in which case you will not need to do that. So now we get to that famous splash screen. I've launched it now multiple times, so I'll just leave one open. We're going to load objects into a model. And when you do that, it will prompt you to choose the file type. We'll choose Excel, and to choose the model we're working with. So we're choosing the EA Foundation sample model, which we've used for training this whole time. Now it will find the spreadsheet in the background. Notice that it's A1 through C8, which is what I wish to load. And I'm going to look now at how it's mapped my columns to my meta model. So it knows that the first column is representing organizations, because if you recall, A1 in my spreadsheet said organization. So that's how it automatically maps to the organization object. So it knows that's what I'm importing. So that's really important. You can also see on the mapping side that it's mapping to name, category, and level. And what I can do is I can actually use this scroll bar at the bottom to check my data. So I can actually use the scroll bar to look through the different instances and make sure everything matches. Once I'm happy that everything matches, I can go ahead, click next. I can also choose a column and skip it if it's something that I have in the spreadsheet but I don't wish to include at this time. So I will leave all those column headers in place, click next, and notice that it says, do you want to draw a diagram? That's because we had the level column, and yes, I do wish to draw a diagram. It's going to ask me what type of diagram to work with. That's really asking me the category of the diagram. So as you can see, I have a few different things here. The only one that really makes sense is a hierarchy for category, unless I had a more specific hierarchy that was just for organizations, but I will simply choose that. And global sales manager, I will just say decomposition. That's the name of our diagram. Hit go to load the content in. And now it wants to know which template to apply. So this is a separate question. The first one was asking about the category. This question is asking me, which template do I want to apply, meaning how do I want this to look? So I'm going to choose the hierarchy template, click on next, and then view diagram. When I click on view diagram, it will open up the diagram for me that I just loaded, including the objects that were just created, and it will launch it in Automodeler. Here is the diagram. As you can see, these are all organizational objects, so they look like each other. They may have different categories, but they have the same style, so they look very similar, and this is the result of our exercise. You can hit F4 to send it to the screen. You can also choose any one of these objects to look at their properties and find that their categories, which were loaded from Excel, are here. So here's a division object. Now, if this was something that didn't exist in the model before, you'll be able to go to the version tab and see when it was created. So we can see the timestamp of date and time, which was just right now, and that's when this object was created. Going back to the slide just for a moment, you can see that what we did was we loaded organizations, their categories, and the levels. And I actually updated the slide to include this latest screenshot, which matches what you would have done in the EA Foundation model. Depending on the type of data you load in, you'll have different results. You can load in processes, systems, technologies, really anything that you wish to have. One thing we can do is we can actually look at this information, look at the organizations on this diagram, and we can do some more things with them in Excel. So that's a really good use case. It's a really good scenario for what can we do with this information once we have it in here. So one thing, for instance, would be to see if these organizations have any roles associated to them. Of course, they don't, since we just created them. So one thing we can do is we can go ahead and go back to the spreadsheet and add a role column. So role is an object that we have in the meta model, and it's something that we can actually associate. As we just saw, we can associate that to an organization. So by launching Excel, we can simply, let's just make a copy of this sheet, and instead of category and level, we'll add a role column. That will allow us to associate a role specific to each organization. We can add brand new roles, or we can look at a list of existing roles to bring them in. Some of the existing roles in this model are accountant, analyst, business consultant, etc. So we will use that information to add some role associations in the spreadsheet. So I will simply just put some roles in, even if they don't exist. So now we have different roles added. And again, I'm going to highlight this information, launch Automodeler, and rewind to the beginning. When I rewind, I will load objects into a model. Again, cell A1 still says organization, so it knows that we're loading organization objects. Because these names have not been modified, Automodeler will match by name and simply add the role associations to those details. So now we have organizations, and we're also loading in the associated role. We can see right here that's what we're doing. And then when we hit go, it has now loaded the roles in. When we come back to our organizations on the diagram, we can actually look at any one of these and see if there is a role associated. So we can see that one has sales lead. One of the things we can do is we can add a shape region for an association to a role for any one of these organizations, so we can actually see that right on the diagram. So the first thing we need to do is simply open up the organization object, and once we're in here, we will add a shape region for an association. And the association, we need to make sure that we don't just say associated applications, as that's a really common mistake to make, but instead choose the actual object that we want to see, and in this case, it's the associated roles. And we only want to see when this association exists, so make sure you display when it exists. For the symbol, let's go ahead and choose the role icon. And then what we need to do is place it somewhere on the diagram. So what we want to do is choose the location to be 0.2 millimeters from the left, and we want that to be 5 millimeters from the top. There's another shape region at that space, and 5 by 5 millimeters in size. Now, you can probably see there's a little overlay of the association name, so we don't want to display the name, but we do want to make it clickable. So when you hover over it, it will show you the name of the associated object, and then we can actually see that. So when we hit OK and OK again, you can see wherever there's an associated role, we can actually see that, and when we hover over it, we will be able to see the name, and then if we double click, it actually shows us information about that role. So using Automodeler allows you not to just bring information in that's new, but also to link to existing information from your spreadsheets, and you can also bring in properties. So it's not just about the associations, it's about the properties and everything in between. The Irwin EABP Automodeler tool is part of the overall suite. It's a very important component because it allows you to work with your data. It lets you take data from the repository, unload it into Excel, for instance, or Word, or a CSV file. Most commonly, it's unloading into Excel, making changes, and loading it back in. It's also used to auto-generate hierarchy diagrams, to add swim lanes to diagrams, and to create other structural visualization diagrams. And all of these depend on the associations to be created. Associations, properties, all of that can be modified and loaded back in with Automodeler. Thank you for your attention.